She used his name to get into a party on the 42nd floor. For one evening, she was Mrs. Hayworth. She was very good at it, right up until he walked through the door. He didn't make a scene. He didn't raise his voice. He crossed the room, said 4 words, and the name she had borrowed all evening landed back on her like something that had always known where it belonged. "Get your things, Mrs. Hayworth." He put her in the car. He told himself the drive to Dorchester was about closing the matter cleanly. He was a man who was honest about everything. Except the exact moment this stopped being about principle. Subscribe. You'll want to know where this goes. And there are more stories like this waiting for you on this channel. Chapter 1. What His Name is Worth. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m. Brandon Hayworth was in the back seat of his car, jacket still on, the city sliding past the tinted window in wet amber and sodium light, and he answered it on the second ring the way he answered everything, without announcing that it was inconvenient. He didn't recognize the number. He answered anyway.
Hayworth.
The voice on the other end carried the particular warmth of a man who was enjoying himself at someone else's expense. Richard Calloway. Brandon identified the voice before the name arrived, the way you identified a smell before your brain supplied the word for it.
Didn't know you'd gotten married.
Brandon said nothing.
Charming girl.
Calloway continued, and the word charming was doing several things at once in his mouth, none of them simple.
Very spirited. She and her friend have been, enlivening my party for the last hour.
A pause, weighted and deliberate.
Didn't know your wife was such an interesting piece of...
Where?
Brandon said. It was not a question. It was a coordinate request. Calloway named the hotel, the Alderton, Back Bay, 42nd floor, private function room, client dinner that had become, apparently, a party. And at the center of that party, according to Calloway's voice, was someone using Brandon's last name like a key to a room she had no business being in.
I'd hate to make things uncomfortable,
Calloway said pleasantly, which meant he would love to make things uncomfortable.
but there's a small contract, the Meridian tender. If you'd like to settle this quietly...
Brandon ended the call. He leaned forward.
The Alderton.
He said.
Now.
He sat back. His jaw was set, and his eyes held the quality of someone moving through a calculation that was already finished. The answer was known. The method was the only remaining variable. He turned his phone over once in his hand. Natalie Newman. He knew the name the way you knew the name of a storm after it had already taken the roof off something. 3 weeks ago, his head of security had placed a single-page report on his desk, and Brandon had read it the way he read threats. Completely. Once, standing up, because some things didn't deserve a chair. 24 years old. Harmon and Reed. Dorchester. Clean record, which meant nothing, because the most disruptive people he had ever encountered had clean records right up until they didn't. And Juniper, his sister, 22 years old, living back at the estate since the winter, only just finding her footing again after 8 months of careful, painful reconstruction, had found one and brought her home like a stray with good eyes. He had sent one message. One, Miss Newman. I appreciate if you stay away from Juniper and stay away from this family. I hope you are careful enough not to take this lightly. The message had not been polite. That was, in fact, the most dangerous thing about it. It had also, he'd been informed the following day, been received and not replied to. And then, the gallery notes. And then a restaurant. And then, apparently, tonight, the 42nd floor of the Alderton and Richard Calloway's party, and the name Mrs. Hayworth given at the reservation desk for a table for 2. He was not a man who required things to happen twice to understand them. The Alderton was the kind of hotel that charged for the idea of staying in it as much as the room itself. Its lobby was a cathedral of pale marble and low gold light, and its 42nd floor private function suites had hosted the kind of deals that remade city blocks without anyone who lived on those blocks ever knowing. The staff moved like water. The guests moved like they owned the water. Brandon moved through it like weather. He didn't stop at reception. He produced from the interior pocket of his jacket a card, matte black, no visible text, held it briefly at the elevator bank, and the attendant stepped aside. The elevator rose. He looked at nothing. His jaw was at the particular angle it reached when he had already decided how a situation would end and was simply traveling toward that ending. The function room was warm and loud with the sound of a party that had outgrown its original purpose. 200 people, perhaps more. The kind of gathering where the music had been turned up an hour ago and everyone had taken it as permission. Brandon saw them before they saw him. It wasn't difficult. Juniper stood near the edge of the dance floor, heels in hand, hair half undone from its pin, wearing the look of someone who had been having a genuine good time and had just, in the last 30 seconds, remembered why that was complicated. Beside her was Natalie Newman, and she was exactly the kind of trouble he had already decided she was. Dark clothing, nothing remarkable, hair that had been neat at some earlier point in the evening. She was speaking to Juniper in a low, quick voice, her back partially turned to the room, and there was something in her posture that read clearly, across the distance, as someone who had just realized the exact depth of the water she was standing in, and was very carefully not panicking. Calloway materialized at his elbow. He was a wide man with a wide smile and the practiced ease of someone who had spent 30 years learning to occupy the moral high ground by renting it rather than owning it.
Hayworth.
He extended a hand. Brandon looked at it. Calloway withdrew it smoothly. Brandon removed from his inner pocket the document his assistant had sent to the concierge desk during the elevator ride, the Meridian tender, and signed it with the pen Calloway produced. Not because Calloway had leverage, because the math was fast and simple, and there was a longer version of this he would settle at a time and place entirely of his own choosing. That was later. He handed the document back.
Living nightmare, that one,
Calloway said, glancing across the room with something in his expression that had no business being there.
Your wife. You're a brave man, Hayworth.
Brandon looked at him.
Enjoy your evening,
He said, and he walked toward his sister. They saw him at the same moment. Juniper's face did what it always did when she'd done something she couldn't defend. It went very still, and then very young. The heels in her hand dropped an inch. The woman beside her turned at Juniper's reaction and looked at him directly. This was the first time he looked at her properly. She looked back. He had a fraction of a second to register her face. Dark eyes, a structure to her features that was more arresting than immediately pretty, a quality of expression that was attempting composure and largely achieving it, before her face did the thing he had been watching for. Recognition, not of who he was, specifically, but of what this moment was. Her chin stayed level, her hands folded at her front with the slow deliberateness of someone making sure they were steady before anyone could check. He stopped in front of them. Juniper opened her mouth. He shook his head. Once. Juniper closed it. He looked at the woman again. His eyes said what the message 3 weeks ago had already said. She held it for a long moment. Then she said,
I can explain.
Get your things, Mrs. Hayworth.
He said it the way you set something down on a table. No force, no edge, just placement, deliberate and exact. And the name she had borrowed and worn all evening landed back on her like something that had always known where it belonged. The explanation died in her throat. The car was at the side exit. His driver held the door. The city beyond the canopy offered its rain without apology, the way November always did, not a storm, just a permanent condition. Juniper got in. Natalie stopped.
I'll take a cab,
she said. The practical tone of someone attempting to restore normal parameters to an abnormal evening. Brandon didn't speak. He reached out and took her wrist. Not hard, not gentle either, simply certain, the way a door closing was certain. His hand circled above her pulse point and he turned toward the car, and she came with him. Not willingly, not unwillingly, simply because the direction had been decided. She didn't pull against it. He released her when she was at the door. She got in. He got in after her. The door closed and the city moved past. In the car, no one spoke. Juniper sat with her heels in her lap and her eyes on the window. Natalie sat very correctly, spine not touching the seat back, hands folded, eyes also on the window. Brandon sat with his arm along the seat edge and his face in profile toward the glass, and the silence had a quality that was almost tangible, like something dry and pressurized, a room in which the oxygen had been carefully measured. Juniper was dropped first. Their mother was at the door before the car reached the gate, which meant she'd been told, which meant his people had been watching. Natalie registered this peripherally, with the half-attention of someone managing their own situation, and whatever happened tonight had not been happening in the dark. Juniper got out. She looked back once at Natalie, and the look carried apology, solidarity, and the particular helplessness of someone who had brought someone else into a storm and couldn't do anything about the rain. Natalie returned the look with something steadier. "Go, I'm fine," it said. The gate closed. The car moved. Her street in Dorchester was narrower than the others. The buildings here were close and real, and the light above her building's door had been half flickering for a month in the way of things belonging to landlords with selective attention. The car stopped. Natalie reached for the door handle. He got out first. She sat a moment, recalibrating. Then she got out, stood on the wet pavement, and looked at him.
Thank you for the car,
she said. Brandon's gaze was on her building's door, then on her.
Key.
He said.
I'm sorry?
He waited, and in the quality of that waiting, she understood. He was not leaving. The understanding arrived without drama, simply as a fact, the way rain arrived. She turned, found her key, and walked to the door. He followed. Up the staircase. 3rd floor, her door. She put the key in the lock, turned it, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The flat was small and warm and neat, street light through the blinds in thin, pale lines, furniture spare and arranged with purpose. She turned to face him. She was already reaching for what she wanted to say. The apology she had been assembling in the car, the one that began with "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," when his hand found her waist. Not tentatively. His arm went around her and pulled, a single decisive motion, drawing her forward and close until the space between them was no longer a space at all. His other hand came to the door frame above her head, and she was close enough now that she could feel the warmth coming off him through both their clothes. She gasped. Small, involuntary, the sound of someone whose body had moved faster than their mind. His face came close to hers, his mouth near her ear.
My name is not a door you walk through without consequence.
She shuddered. It moved through her completely, and his hand was right there at her waist, feeling every degree of it, and there was nowhere to take it back to. He went still. The kind of still that meant something had been registered. He looked at her. The line of her throat, the slight part of her lips, her eyes, which were open and very dark and looking at him without any of the composure she had been keeping so carefully all evening. He kissed her. It arrived with the same completeness as everything else about him. Not a question, not tentative, simply there, decided. His hand at her waist held her in place, and she was small against him in a way he hadn't accounted for, and the whole careful architecture of her had come apart in his hands without announcement. He felt the exact moment she stopped thinking. She made a sound against his mouth. His hand tightened fractionally at her waist. Then he broke it, pulled back by an inch. He looked at her, at the slight unsteadiness of her breath, at the key still in her hand, at all the evidence of a woman who had been causing him considerable difficulty and was currently causing him a very different kind. He understood, in the following second, that this had been her first kiss. Something moved through him that he immediately, professionally, declined to examine. His mouth moved, something between a thought and a smile. The place where Rye lived.
I was told,
He said quietly.
that you were a living nightmare.
She said nothing. Possibly couldn't. He looked at her once more, at the whole of her, standing thoroughly undone in her own doorway, and stepped back. His hand left her waist. The air moved in between them.
My office. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock.
He said.
You owe me considerably, Miss Newman. I intend to collect.
She found her voice somewhere.
Collect?
Tomorrow. 9.
He turned and walked back down the corridor the way he had come, unhurried, even-footed. The outer door closed with a weight that carried all the way up through the building's bones. Natalie stood in her doorway. She became aware of this slowly, then aware of her hand, which was not entirely steady, and then aware of her breathing, which had been doing things without consulting her. One hand came up, 2 fingers pressed briefly against her mouth. She dropped them. She went inside. She closed the door and locked it. She stood there for a long time. Chapter 2. Where Everything Began. 6 weeks before that night, before the Alderton, before the reckoning, before any of it, there was a gallery on Marlborough Street and a Friday evening with nothing better to do. The exhibition was called Quiet Architectures, which Natalie had found out from a flyer taped to the break room wall at Harmon and Reed, presumably because the phrase "free entry" Friday evening was printed at the bottom in letters larger than the title. She had not particularly wanted to go. She went because her flat had a ceiling that dripped philosophically near the kitchen window when the rain was heavy, and the rain on this particular Friday was very heavy, and the gallery on Marlborough Street was not her flat and had, according to the flyer, heating. She arrived at 7:30 in a coat that was good enough and shoes that were suffering. The gallery was a mid-sized Victorian terrace renovated into something open and pale. The work on the walls was architectural photography. Large format, black and white, the bones of buildings stripped of their occupants and hung for consideration. Natalie took a glass of wine from the table near the entrance. She looked at the first photograph. She looked at the second. She stopped at the third. It was a spiral staircase, shot from below, geometry climbing into light. Someone had placed beside it on the small white shelf holding the title card a handwritten paper note. This one is showing off. The handwriting was neat, considered, the kind that took time. Natalie looked around, then back at the note. She reached into her bag, found a pen, found the back of a receipt, and wrote, "The building earned it." She placed it beside the existing note and moved on. At the 5th photograph, a brutalist housing block in winter, all horizontal shadow, there was another note. "No one asked to be born here." She wrote, "No one asked to leave either." She found the source at the 8th photograph. A young woman, dark coat, hair pinned back in the way of someone who'd done it quickly and without a mirror, standing with a small notebook open in her palm. She had the quality of someone used to taking up less space than she was entitled to. She placed her newest note, and then looked up and found Natalie watching her. She didn't startle. She assessed. Natalie held up her receipt.
"I've been replying,"
she said. The young woman looked at the receipt, then at Natalie, then slowly at the notes placed at the earlier photographs, her eyes moving along the room, accounting for each one.
"The captions on the wall are terrible."
Natalie held out the pen. The young woman looked at it, then took it.
"I'm Juniper,"
she said.
"Natalie."
They moved through the remaining 7 photographs together. The notes became collaborative. Juniper wrote the observations, Natalie wrote the rejoinders, and somewhere around photograph 11, the 2 voices had started to sound like one person arguing both sides of a very good-natured case. The other gallery visitors stepped past without paying much attention, which made it better.
"They'll notice when they close up,"
Natalie said.
"Probably,"
Juniper agreed. They looked at what they'd left. 14 photographs, 14 small conversations on folded paper. Not damage, not even particularly wrong, simply unauthorized and small and entirely their own. The kind of thing 2 people discovered they could do together and couldn't have done alone. Juniper looked at it with the expression of someone reviewing work she was unexpectedly pleased with.
"I haven't done something like that in a while,"
she said.
"How long is a while?"
8 months.
The precision of someone who counted from a specific day. Natalie didn't ask what had happened 8 months ago. She asked,
"Are you hungry?"
They went to a restaurant 2 streets over that was warm and too loud and served pasta that was better than it needed to be. They sat for 2 hours. Natalie talked about her job, mid-sized firm, regulatory affairs, nothing that made good conversation. And Juniper talked carefully and selectively about her drawing and about the city, and how she found it easier to think around buildings than most people. They walked back through the rain afterward, and at the corner where their directions diverged, Juniper held out her phone with the quiet directness of someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to perform it. Natalie put her number in.
Next week,
Juniper said.
there's a thing at the park, if you want.
What kind of thing?
I don't know yet.
Juniper said, which was probably true and possibly not. Natalie said,
Sure.
Neither of them knew that the gallery's night security had already filed a report. Neither of them knew that the report had been forwarded, with the careful thoroughness of people paid to be thorough, to an office on the 23rd floor of a building on Boylston Street. Neither of them knew that the man in that office had read it, set it down, looked at the city for a long moment and thought, not about the notes, which were harmless, but about the fact of a stranger becoming necessary to someone he could not afford to leave unprotected. Then he had called his head of personal security.
Tell me about Natalie Newman.
He'd said. He had learned her name on a Friday evening. He had sent the message on Saturday. She had not replied. He had noted that. And 3 weeks later, standing in the entrance of a party on the 42nd floor of the Alderton with Calloway's voice still in his ear and the name Mrs. Hayworth sitting on a reservation ledger that he personally paid for, he had crossed the room toward her with the particular quality of attention a man gave to a situation he had already been patient about once. The patience, she would find, had a limit, and it had reached it. Chapter 3. The 23rd floor. The building did not announce itself. It stood among louder neighbors on Boylston, glass towers, revolving doors that swallowed and released importance by the minute. Brandon Hayworth's headquarters did none of that. Its facade was darkened glass and limestone, unbranded, reflective, a structure that preferred to be recognized rather than introduced. Natalie paused before the entrance just long enough for the wind to press her coat against her ribs. 9 o'clock. The revolving door carried her inside. The lobby was cathedral quiet. She approached the desk.
I have an appointment,
She said, and heard how small the sentence sounded in a room designed for contracts. The receptionist did not ask her name twice. A glance at the screen, a nod.
23rd floor.
The elevator doors closed with a muted seal. As the numbers climbed, the memory of the night before returned not in sequence but in sensation. The firmness of his hand at her waist, the low timbre of his voice close to her ear, the way the corridor light had flickered after he left, as though even electricity had hesitated. She straightened her shoulders before the doors opened. The 23rd floor felt different from the lobby, less open, more deliberate. Frosted glass walls framed offices that were spacious without appearing indulgent. Desks were clear, screens dark unless in use. A woman looked up from the central desk. She was seated as though the chair had been designed around her, heels crossed, posture effortless, hair pinned in a style that suggested it had never known wind. Her suit was a shade of deep charcoal that sharpened everything about her. On her desk, a silver nameplate caught the light. Megan Reeves. She regarded Natalie for a beat too long.
Yes?
I'm here to see Mr. Hayworth.
A faint pause. Megan's gaze moved across Natalie with the efficiency of someone completing a task they'd already decided the outcome of.
Of course you are.
Megan said lightly.
You're the 9.
Natalie felt the weight of that word settle. Not the time, but the category. The 9. The appointment. The thing to be processed and moved along. Megan rose, smoothing a crease from her sleeve that wasn't there. Up close, there was something immaculate about her. Perfume restrained, jewelry minimal, nails precise. The sort of woman who did not need to raise her voice to be heard and knew it. Megan led Natalie down the corridor.
You should know, Brandon appreciates resistance.
Natalie glanced at her.
Resistance?
He enjoys being challenged, contradicted.
A faint smile. They stopped before a glass door at the end of the corridor. Through it, Brandon stood at the far window, phone to his ear. In the glass, Megan's reflection overlapped his.
Be interesting,
She said softly.
It's the only way to survive here.
She opened the door. Natalie stepped inside. The office was large without being ostentatious. Dark wood, steel shelving, a long table scattered with architectural models and leather-bound files. Brandon did not turn immediately. His voice carried evenly through the room.
No.
He was saying into the phone.
Push the acquisition through Q3. If we wait for approval, we lose the north parcel.
Natalie stood near the desk, hands folded. On the table beside her lay a thin folder open to a map. She glanced at it without meaning to. The north parcel was marked in red. So was a boundary line cutting straight through it. On the phone, Brandon continued.
It's minimal risk.
Natalie's fingers tightened slightly at her sides. Minimal. She had spent 2 years working in regulatory affairs. She knew what that line meant. She knew what it would cost if no one caught it before the submission went through. Not just money, but the entire deal, the relationship, the trust that made the next deal possible. Megan's voice moved through her memory. Contradict him. He respects it. She did not mean to speak.
It's not minimal.
The words left her before she could do anything about them. Brandon turned. The room seemed to adjust its alignment. He lowered the phone but did not end the call. His eyes moved to the map, then to her, and the quality of his attention shifted, the kind of look that arrived when something had interrupted the expected order of things. Brandon's gaze did not leave her.
Send me the revised figures.
He said into the phone.
Now.
He ended the call. Silence settled, not empty but charged, the way air felt before something decided to happen. Megan stood just outside the glass door, watching through the faint opacity of the frosted panel. Natalie did not look at her. She was already looking at the map, composing what she was going to say when he asked her to explain herself. He crossed the space between them. The movement was unhurried, but she felt it like a change in air pressure. He stopped close enough that she could see the fine seam at the shoulder of his jacket, the faint shadow along his jaw. He was carrying the same quality he'd carried in the corridor outside her flat the night before, the quality of a man who had already decided where the conversation was going. Her pulse registered this before she did. She remembered the doorway, the hand at her waist, the way her own breath had stopped being reliable. He reached toward her. Her hand came up. The pen from his desk was in her fingers before she had made any decision to put it there, held between them at an angle that could not be interpreted any other way than the way it looked.
Don't,
she said. The word landed harder than she intended. Brandon looked at the pen, then at her face. There was no anger in his expression, only a stillness, a narrowing, a recalibration, the look of a man who had just received a piece of information he was filing carefully and without comment.
Is that what you thought?
He said. The heat reached her face before she could do anything about it. He took the pen from her fingers, set it back on the desk with exact alignment, parallel to the edge.
I was going to move the file.
He said.
It was in my way.
The sentence arrived in the room and stayed there. Natalie looked at the file. It was, in fact, directly between him and the architectural model he'd been facing. She looked at her own empty hand. She looked at the pen on the desk. The full weight of what she had just done assembled itself and landed on her in one complete and entirely unhurried moment.
5 months,
he said. She blinked.
I'm sorry?
He moved to his side of the desk and sat, with the ease of someone returning to something interrupted.
My current assistant is on leave. I need someone for the transition, and then on a full-time basis for 5 months. The salary will be applied against what you owe me.
He opened the folder on his desk.
At the end of 5 months, the account between us is closed.
She stared at him.
You're offering me a job.
I'm solving a problem.
He said without looking up.
You've been costing me since October. I'm merely formalizing the arrangement.
He paused.
You are demonstrably someone who reads a map correctly. The other qualities I'm less certain about.
She stood in front of his desk and thought about the pen, about the angle of it, about his face when he looked at it. Not insulted, not amused, something more difficult to name than either.
And if I refuse?
She said. He looked up then.
You won't.
The certainty of it was worse than an argument would have been. She looked around the office, the desk with nothing on it that didn't have a purpose, the models positioned with surgical precision, the city arranged behind glass like something he'd also organized. Then she looked at him.
The south parcel.
She said. He went still.
Buy it first. It anchors the boundary line, makes the risk manageable before you go to planning.
The silence lasted 4 seconds. He studied her the way she imagined he studied buildings, looking for where the load sat, where the weak points were, what was holding what up.
You start tomorrow.
He said. Natalie absorbed this.
Tomorrow.
She confirmed. She moved toward the door. Her hand was on the handle when he said, without looking up from the desk.
Miss Newman,
She stopped.
the pen
He said.
stays on your side of the desk.
She walked out. The corridor swallowed her. Behind the frosted glass, Megan's silhouette shifted, straightened, moved away. The small, precise movement of someone who had been watching and was now finished watching. Natalie did not look at her. She kept walking until she reached the elevator, and she pressed the button, and she stood in front of the closed doors and looked at her own reflection in the polished steel and thought, you held a pen up at the man, as a shield, against something he was not doing. The elevator arrived. She got in. The building across the street caught the late afternoon light as she was leaving. She paused at the lobby doors, coat on, bag over her shoulder, and looked at it through the glass. It was a pale stone building with arched windows that did something unnecessarily beautiful with the angle of the 4 o'clock sun, and it sat there in the Boston afternoon with the ease of something that had been standing long enough to stop caring what anyone thought of it. She pushed through the door into the cold. She called Juniper from the pavement.
Well?
Juniper answered before the first ring had finished.
5 months.
Natalie said.
His assistant. Salary against what I owe him.
A silence, then.
He offered you a job.
Also, there was a...
She stopped. She thought about the pen, the angle of it, his face.
a moment
She said carefully.
that I am not going to describe.
Juniper's pause had weight in it.
Was it your fault?
Entirely.
Did he say anything?
He said the pen stays on my side of the desk.
Another pause, longer than the one before it.
Natalie,
Juniper said.
Don't.
I wasn't going to say anything.
You are absolutely going to say something.
I was going to say, welcome to the building.
Natalie looked up at it. 23 floors of pale stone and clean glass, and the particular contained order of a man who had decided, some years ago, exactly how the world would be arranged and had arranged it. She started walking toward the bus stop. On the 23rd floor, in an office that had been restored to its correct order, Brandon sat at his desk with the Henderson file open in front of him and did not read it. He was thinking about the pen, specifically about the expression on her face the moment she understood what she had done. Not shock, not embarrassment in the ordinary sense, but something more honest than either. The look of someone catching themselves in a truth they hadn't meant to tell. He had not been going to kiss her. He had been reaching for the file. He closed the Henderson folder. He opened it again. He was thinking about whether a person could be genuinely competent and genuinely ridiculous in the same moment, and whether that combination was the most inconvenient thing he had encountered in a professional context, and whether the answer to both questions being yes was something he had fully considered before saying 5 months. He had not, he acknowledged, fully considered it. He looked at the desk. The pen was exactly where he had placed it, parallel to the edge, precisely aligned. He went back to work. Chapter 4. The week that tested her. She arrived at 8:15 on Wednesday, which was later than her usual 7:45 and earlier than anyone else. The floor was still empty. Miranda, the assistant she was covering, left briefing folder in the top drawer of her desk. She took her coffee into his office to set down the morning briefing folder. The building across the street was doing something with the early light. The sun had found the angle of its arched windows and was making the most of it. Pale stone gone briefly gold, the whole facade lit in a way that was, she thought, genuinely excessive for a Tuesday. Wednesday, she corrected herself. It was Wednesday. She looked at the whiteboard. It was clean. It was always clean. He erased it at the end of each day with the same precision he applied to everything else. No ghost lines, no residue, simply a surface returned to its original state. She set the briefing folder on the desk. She looked at the building. She looked at the whiteboard. She picked up the black marker and wrote in the bottom right corner, small and unhurried. The building across the street is showing off again. She capped the marker, put it back, took her coffee and went to her desk. He arrived at 8:42. She heard him cross the floor, heard his office door open. The usual sequence of sounds, jacket off, phone face down on the desk, the soft impact of the briefing folder being opened. Then silence. A longer silence than the briefing folder usually produced. She kept her eyes on her screen. At 8:51, he came to the door of his office and looked at her. She looked back.
It was designed that way.
He said.
This building and that one. The same architect. The windows are angled to respond to each other at a specific time of morning.
Natalie looked at him.
It isn't showing off.
He said.
It's answering.
He went back to his desk. She turned back to her screen. She was not going to look at the building across the street and think about that. She was not going to consider what it meant that he had not erased the note. She was not going to examine the fact that he had answered it. Out loud, to her face, as if the question had been worth a response. She opened the calendar system. She had work to do. The first problem appeared by Thursday. Someone had redirected a priority email into a folder she hadn't been told existed, created before she started, labeled archive, processed, as though the message had already been dealt with. It hadn't. She found it in under a minute, had the summary on his desk before his 10 o'clock call, and said nothing about how she'd found it, because the thing about a trap was that you could step around it without announcing you'd seen it. The second problem was the calendar. 3 executive meetings had been scheduled for the same slot on Friday morning, all marked unmovable, the last one added late on a night she hadn't been in the building. She spent the afternoon working through the whole week, finding where the weight sat, where the redundancies were. And by 5:30 she had cleared the overlap and sent Brandon a revised schedule with one line of explanation. He read it, didn't respond. She went home. At the board pre-brief on Friday, a board member looked across the table and asked the room who she was. Megan answered from the doorway.
Temporary cover. She'll be gone in a few months.
Brandon said nothing. He picked up the folder and walked out. She followed. He used every item on her revised schedule for the rest of the day without comment. She had not expected him to do otherwise. At 4:30, he called her in. She sat. He turned his screen toward her. The activity log showing the 2 problems she had quietly solved.
The email.
He said.
It was redirected.
Yes.
You found it anyway.
Yes,
The calendar conflict.
Resolve.
she said.
You didn't ask anyone to look into either of them.
No.
He held her gaze. There was something in the quality of his attention that was different from the measuring look she had come to recognize. Less assessment, more something she didn't have a name for yet.
Why not?
He said. She thought about Megan at the door of the boardroom, the warm efficiency of temporary cover, the exact timing of both problems.
Because finding the problem quietly is more useful than announcing it loudly.
She said. He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary.
Very well, Miss Newman.
He said.
You are free to go.
He said it the way a man said something he was still deciding whether he meant. She stood. She took her bag and left. She did not look back. She was putting her coat on at the elevator when Juniper appeared. Not called ahead, not announced, simply there, sketchbook under her arm, slightly out of breath, wearing the look of someone who had made a decision on the bus and hadn't reconsidered it since.
I was in the area.
Juniper said.
You live in Brookline.
Natalie said.
I was in the area spiritually.
Natalie looked at her for a moment. Then she took her coat back off and said,
Come on.
She took Juniper to the small kitchen at the end of the floor, made tea with the focus of someone who had learned exactly where everything was and in what order, and set a cup in front of her without asking what she wanted because she already knew. Chamomile. No sugar. Juniper had mentioned it once, 2 weeks ago, in passing. Juniper wrapped both hands around it. She talked about a new piece she was working on, a series of interiors drawn from the outside looking in. Her hands moved when she described it, sketching shapes in the air that only she could see. Her voice had a quality to it that it didn't always have. Unheld, unguarded, the voice of someone who had remembered they were allowed to take up space. Natalie listened and asked one question, the right one, and Juniper answered it for 10 minutes. At 6:40, they left together, coats on, Juniper still talking at the elevator. Natalie said something quiet that made her laugh, a real one, sudden and unplanned, the kind that arrived before a person could decide whether to allow it. Brandon came out of his office as the elevator doors opened. He stopped. He stood in the corridor and watched his sister step into the elevator mid-laugh, sketchbook pressed to her chest, the drawing she'd been describing already half-forming in her hands. Natalie followed, said something over her shoulder that he didn't catch, and the doors closed. The floor settled back into its end-of-day quiet. 8 months. He had spent 8 months providing everything he knew how to provide, and watching Juniper get quieter anyway, drawing smaller, taking up less space on every surface she occupied. He had not known how to reverse it. He had not found the right shape for what she needed. He looked at the elevator doors. 1 week, chamomile tea and the right question and a laugh in a corridor. He went back to his office, sat, looked at the whiteboard, at the small, neat handwriting still in the corner that he had not erased, and thought about the particular kind of person who remembered how someone took their tea after hearing it once, in passing, 2 weeks ago. He had been certain she was a problem to be managed. He was considerably less certain of that now. He picked up his jacket and went home. Chapter 5. What she is instead. By the 2nd month, she had learned the shape of his silences. There were 3 distinct kinds: the silence of someone working, the silence of someone thinking, and the 3rd kind, rarer, heavier, which arrived when she said something he hadn't anticipated. That one she was most careful around. She had also, by the 2nd month, learned to trust her own usefulness. The building no longer looked at her as something temporary. The work spoke for itself. The job was hers in every way that mattered. What she had not learned, despite 2 months of considerable effort, was how to stop thinking about a man whose mouth she still remembered at 11 o'clock in Dorchester when the rain was reliable and honesty became unavoidable. The text came at 7:43 on a Thursday evening. Natalie was still at her desk on the 23rd floor, jacket on, bag at her feet in the 10-minute window between finishing a file and finding the will to leave it, when Juniper's name lit her phone screen. There is an underground auction. Tonight. Fort Point. Old Wool Warehouse. No name on the door. 3rd alley off Congress. Everything is illegal and beautiful. You are coming. Natalie read it twice. She picked up her bag. The warehouse had no name on the door as advertised. What it had was 3 floors of salvaged industrial scaffolding strung with Edison bulbs, 60 people who had been told about this by someone who had been told about it by someone else, and walls lined with art that had not been permitted, curated, insured, or officially declared to exist. Paintings the size of car doors, sculptures built from reclaimed rebar. A girl in the corner selling lithographs from a suitcase with the matter-of-fact energy of someone running a very small, very committed revolution. Juniper was already inside when Natalie arrived, standing in front of a large canvas with her sketchbook open and an expression of complete, undivided rapture.
I thought you'd skip.
She said without turning, the way people said things when they had known all along you would.
You said everything was illegal and beautiful.
Natalie said.
That is a combination I find difficult to resist.
The evening was, by any reasonable measure, wonderful. The auction was run by a young man in paint-stained trousers who wielded a hammer instead of a gavel and who accepted bids written on torn paper when the cash ran short. Juniper bid on 3 pieces. She won 1, a small oil of a fire escape in winter, which she clutched like a recovered thing, and lost the other 2 with the cheerful equanimity of someone who had expected to lose and was simply glad to have been in the room. Natalie spent 40 minutes in quiet conversation with a sculptor who worked in reclaimed ship parts and who spoke about his materials with the precision of someone in love with the specific gravity of things. She did not bid. She also did not leave. She should have, perhaps, left an hour earlier, gone home with sensible timing and a clear conscience. She was reaching for Juniper's arm to say exactly that when the warehouse door opened and the temperature in the room changed. Not literally. The cold didn't reach this far in. What changed was a quality in the room, a small collective recalibration, the way a room full of people registered the arrival of something that didn't quite fit the established order of things. Brandon Hayworth did not belong in an unlicensed art auction in a wool warehouse in Fort Point. His suit cost more than the entire contents of the girl's suitcase. His posture was the posture of someone accustomed to rooms that had been prepared for him. He looked at the room once, then he looked at her. Beside her, Juniper had gone the particular shade of still that meant she had already identified the situation and was reevaluating every decision that had led to it.
He found us,
Juniper said, barely audible.
How does he always find us?
Natalie didn't answer that. She already knew. The people he paid to be thorough were, in fact, very thorough. He crossed the floor toward them. He did not move quickly. He did not need to. The distance between the door and where they stood closed anyway, the way it always did when he moved through a room, by virtue of gravity. He stopped in front of them. He looked at Juniper. She looked at her painting. Then she looked at the middle distance. Then she looked at the floor.
The car.
He said to her quietly.
Now.
Juniper went, clutching her fire escape painting with both hands, eyes carefully averted, moving in the manner of someone executing a strategic withdrawal. He turned to Natalie. The 60 people in the warehouse had performed an admirable collective act of suddenly finding other things to look at, but the radius around them had cleared. It was just the 2 of them in that small, acoustically perfect space, and the Edison bulbs, and the smell of turpentine and cold stone.
Miss Newman.
Mr. Hayworth?
She kept her voice level. The effort this required was considerable.
We've had this conversation,
he said. His voice was low, not loud enough to carry. Somehow that made it worse.
I believe the first time it occurred in a different venue, but the substance was the same. Juniper.
She said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She understood this. He did not want an explanation. He had already decided what the evening was, and an explanation would only be something else for him to be unimpressed by. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved. Not away. Toward her. He closed the remaining distance in 2 unhurried steps and stopped just behind her shoulder. Not in front of her, not facing her, but beside her and slightly behind, in the place where a person had to choose between turning to look and holding perfectly still. The kind of position that made even the air around it feel like a decision. She held still. His voice came low, close to her ear, quiet enough that it didn't carry. The warehouse and its 60 people might as well have been in another city.
I think,
he said.
You may have forgotten what happened the last time. I warned you.
A pause. Precise. Waited. She had not forgotten. At her door, the kiss that arrived without asking, and the sound she had made that she still could not think about without her face doing something inconvenient. She remembered every degree of it, including what it felt like when he stopped, which was, she suspected, precisely what he knew. He stepped back. The warmth of him left her shoulder.
My office,
he said, conversationally, as if the last 30 seconds had not happened.
7:30.
He turned and walked to the door. He did not look back. He walked through the warehouse and out into the Fort Point alley, and the door closed behind him with the weight of a man who had said exactly what he meant and would not be revisiting it. Around Natalie, the room quietly resumed. She stood very still in the middle of it, the Edison bulbs warm above her and the smell of paint all around, and breathed once, carefully, through her nose. Then she went to find her coat. The following morning she arrived at 7:28, 2 minutes early, which she resented even as she did it. His office was already lit. He was already at his desk, which meant he had either arrived before 7 or had never left, and she declined to examine which of those possibilities she found more troubling. He did not look up when she came in. He gestured toward the chair on the other side of the desk. She sat. The silence ran for 40 seconds. She counted. Then he set his pen down.
I need to understand
He said without preamble.
what you think you are doing.
Repaying a debt, she said. You said so yourself.
At this desk. Not at underground auctions in Fort Point warehouses.
That was my evening, she said. Off the clock. You employ me 9 to 6. What I do at 7:43 does not appear in my contract.
He looked at her. That particular look, the one where nothing on his face moved and everything behind it was in motion.
The contract doesn't exempt you from the rest of your obligations.
He said.
I want you to understand that I have not changed my mind, Miss Newman. Treat my requests as optional, at your own risk.
A pause. Then, with a precision that made it feel like a door being quietly bolted.
Am I clear?
She held the look for 1 beat longer than was safe. Then,
Perfectly.
he picked up his pen. The meeting was over. She stood, gathered the notepad she had not opened, and walked out. She sat at her desk. She opened her screen. She waited for her pulse to return to its normal pace, which took longer than she thought was dignified. By 11 o'clock, the floor had settled into its usual rhythm. Brandon was in his office with the door closed. The strategy team was in the glass conference room. Natalie was at her desk and her phone was at her ear, and she was doing the thing she did when she needed to put something down somewhere safe.
He doesn't say anything,
She said quietly.
That's the whole method. He looks at you with that face and lets the silence do all the work, and somehow you end up feeling like you've committed a crime.
Juniper, on the other end of the line, made the sound of someone who had grown up in that silence and had opinions about it.
He knows exactly what he's doing.
Natalie continued.
It's not restraint, it's a weapon.
She became aware in the way you became aware of weather, of someone passing behind her. Unhurried. Even-footed. The particular quality of a man who had not just turned the corner but had been at that corner for long enough to have formed a considered opinion about everything he'd heard. She understood this before she turned. A low voice, close enough that it was clearly only for her, and carrying the specific quality of someone who had been enjoying themselves for an indeterminate amount of time.
I don't use silence as a weapon, Miss Newman. I simply don't fill it unnecessarily.
He didn't stop walking. Natalie sat very still, the phone against her ear, looking at her screen. On the other end of the line, Juniper had gone quiet in a way that meant she had heard every word.
Natalie,
She said.
I'll hang up.
Natalie said.
Don't forget to fill me in later.
The call ended. Natalie set her phone face down on the desk and did not move for a moment. The heat had reached her face. That specific, unmanageable warmth that arrived when something had happened that her composure had no prepared response for. She was aware of her own stillness, of the open floor around her, of the faint possibility that he had not yet fully rounded the corridor and was still, at this precise moment, being quietly, privately delighted somewhere within earshot. She pressed both hands flat against the desk and breathed once through her nose. Then she opened the North Parcel file and went back to work. The night after the phone call, she stayed late. Not unusually late. The contract deadline was Thursday, and there was legitimate work to justify it. But the floor had emptied by 8, and the overhead lights had shifted to their reduced evening setting, and she was still at her desk at 9:47 with the city dark behind the glass and the particular quiet of a building that had stopped performing and was simply existing. She heard him before she saw him. He stopped at the edge of her desk. She looked up. He had his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the particular state of a man who had been working for several hours without an audience and had forgotten, briefly, to reassemble himself. He was holding a file and looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not the working face, not the thinking face, something quieter than both.
You're still here,
He said.
The Morrow Annex needs cross-referencing before Thursday.
He looked at her screen, then at her, a beat too long for it to be nothing.
Go home, Miss Newman.
She looked at the unfinished document, then at him.
When I finish the annex.
He said nothing. He set the file he was carrying on the corner of her desk, not her problem, just placed there, in the way he placed things he intended to return to, and went back to his office. The door stayed open. She went back to work. At some point past 11, she rested her head on her folded arms for a moment. Just a moment, because next page required a clear mind, and she would return to it in 60 seconds. She did not return to it in 60 seconds. He looked up from his desk at 11:30, and through the glass panel saw her head on her arms and the screen still lit in front of her, and the files arranged in the careful columns of someone who had meant to keep working. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up. He crossed the floor and stood at her desk. She was deeply under, the particular undefended stillness of someone who had been pushing past tired for several hours and had finally lost the argument. Her face, without the composure she carried through every working hour, was something he had been careful not to look at directly. He looked at it now. He took his jacket from the back of his chair and crossed back to her desk and settled it carefully over her shoulders. She didn't stir. He should have gone back to his office. He didn't go back to his office. He stood there for a moment in the dim light with his hand still at the edge of her shoulder where the jacket had settled, and looked at her face, and then at her hair, which had come loose from wherever she'd pinned it and fallen forward across her cheek. He reached out. His fingers found the loose strands and moved them back, slowly, carefully, tucking them behind her ear with a gentleness that had nothing to do with the 23rd floor or the contract or any of the careful architecture he had built between them. His hand stilled at her jaw. 1 breath, 2. He stepped back. He stood in the middle of the empty floor for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who has just done something he did not give himself permission to do and is now conducting a very brief, very private reckoning with that fact. Then he went back to his office, sat down, and did not immediately return to the file in front of him. Outside, the city held its usual indifference. The building across the street answered back in dark glass and pale light. He went back to work. She slept on, undisturbed, with his jacket on her shoulders and one strand of hair still not quite where he had put it. Chapter 6. What She Built. The email reached Brandon directly on a Thursday morning in the 4th month. She did not know this until she walked past his open office door at 9:15 and saw, from the angle of the corridor, the quality of stillness at his desk. Not the working stillness, not the thinking stillness, the other kind. The kind that meant something had arrived that required him to be very still with it before he decided what to do. He looked up. He looked at her. The look lasted 2 seconds. It held nothing she could name, and it was the most alarming thing she had seen in 4 months. He went back to his screen. She went to her desk. At 10 o'clock, his head of legal walked past without making eye contact and went into Brandon's office and closed the door. She understood then that something had happened that she did not yet have all the pieces of. She sat very still and waited for the shape of it to become clear. He did not call her in. That was the first thing. In 4 months, he had never let a significant development sit without bringing her into the room where it was being handled. Not today. Calls were made with the door closed. At 2 o'clock, he left the building and did not tell her where he was going, which had also never happened. She managed his diary. She always knew where he was. She checked the calendar. He had blocked the afternoon himself from his phone at 9:17, 2 minutes after he had looked at her in the corridor. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to the access log for the files connected to the North Parcel Review. She had learned in week 1 that this was where the shape of a problem first showed itself. The last entry was from a shared administrative login. 10 days ago, the same login that had moved the email in week 1, the same login that had created the calendar collision, the same late hour. The pattern was visible once you knew to look for it. She printed the log and set it on his desk with her initials on the cover. She said nothing. He did not mention it when he returned. He did not mention it the next day either, or the day after that. It was not dramatic, the way he withdrew. He was, if anything, more formally correct than he had ever been. Her briefings acknowledged, her schedules used, her work actioned without revision. But the door was closed more than it had been. He no longer looked up when she crossed the floor. The quality of the silence between them, which had always had content in it, had become something she could not read. Opaque in the way glass became opaque when the light behind it changed. She understood what the email had contained. She had reconstructed it from the shape of the reaction. The legal team, the blocked afternoon, the 2-second look that had said everything and confirmed nothing. She knew her name was in it. She knew it was addressed to Calloway because it was always going to be Calloway, and she knew that the combination of her name and his name in the same document, to a man who had stood in the Alderton and signed away a contract because of a situation that had begun with her, was not a small thing to ask him to dismiss. He was not accusing her. He was also not accusing her. He was holding it, the way he held things, completely, without showing the weight of it, waiting for the evidence to become unambiguous before he moved. She understood this about him. She also understood that she could resolve it in 10 minutes if she walked into his office and laid out the log and the timeline and said, "Here is what actually happened. Here is who did it. Here is the proof." She did not. She was not entirely sure why, at first. She turned it over in the evenings in her flat in Dorchester with the rain on the window and the particular quiet of a person sitting with something they hadn't finished deciding. By the 4th day, she understood. If she defended herself, he would believe her. She was fairly certain of that, but the belief would be constructed on evidence she had provided. It would be her case, made by her, accepted by him. And she needed, for reasons she could not fully articulate but felt with some precision, for him to arrive at the truth himself. Not because she had led him there. She went to work. She did her job. She did not explain herself. On the 6th day, Juniper called. Not about anything in particular. That was how Juniper's best conversations began, with nothing in particular, arriving somewhere unexpected. They talked for half an hour. About the new series, about the light in the Brookline flat, about a building near Fort Point with a fire escape that went nowhere. Then Juniper said, in the offhand way she said things that were not offhand at all.
He called me last week.
Natalie kept her voice even.
Brandon?
Just to check in. He does, about once a week. Has done since it was bad.
A pause.
He never talks about himself when he calls. He asks about the work. He asks if I'm sleeping. Last week, he asked whether I was still seeing the therapist.
Natalie said nothing. She was listening with the specific attention she gave to things being said carefully.
The point is,
Juniper said,
he's not very good at asking for the things he needs. He's excellent at providing them, terrible at receiving them. He built all of this.
And Natalie understood she meant the company, the building, the careful order of everything on the 23rd floor.
To protect what mattered. And he is genuinely not very good at admitting when the thing that needs protecting is him.
Silence on the line.
Juniper.
Natalie said.
I'm not saying anything.
Juniper said.
You're absolutely saying something.
I'm saying.
Juniper said with the careful precision of someone placing each word exactly where they meant it.
That when he finds something that matters, he doesn't let go. He just doesn't always know how to say it. That's all.
A beat.
I also know about the 10 days. He didn't tell me. I just know him.
Natalie sat with that for a long moment.
He'll figure it out,
She said finally.
Yes,
Juniper said.
he will. That's the thing about him.
They said goodbye, and Natalie sat in her flat in the quiet and thought about a man who was excellent at providing what mattered and could not ask for it himself, and thought, I can wait. He had not stopped thinking about the access log she had left on his desk. She had not mentioned it. She had not asked if he'd seen it, not followed up, not offered the explanation it clearly invited. She had simply placed it there, initialed, and continued as if she had done nothing more than file a document. That, he had learned, was what she looked like when she was giving him something and trusting him to understand it without being told. He picked up the log on the 5th day. He sat with it unopened for a long moment, the folder in his hands, the floor quiet around him. He did not open it because he expected to find her guilty. He already knew she wasn't. He had known from the 2-second look in the corridor, from the way she had gone back to her desk without a word, without a shift in her expression, without the particular quality of someone who had done something and was waiting to see if it landed. If she had done it, he would have known. He always knew. And yet he had not asked. He opened the folder. The trail, once someone looked for it, was not complicated. The same login, the same late hour, the same pattern, every action timed to land on her. The misdirected email in week 1, the calendar collision. And 11 days ago, the leak. Her name sent to Calloway. The information shaped to look like it had come from her, timed to reach him before any evidence could reach Brandon. It had not been careless. It had been patient and layered and built with the knowledge of someone who understood exactly how this floor worked, how Brandon thought, and how a case against a new assistant could be made to look like the new assistant's own doing. The kind of knowledge that came from years inside the architecture of a place. He closed the folder. He looked at the whiteboard. Her handwriting was still there. He did not involve Natalie. The meeting was at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. It ran 22 minutes. Megan left the building at 3:24 and did not return. Her office was cleared over the weekend. She did not contest the terms of her departure. Calloway, who had been waiting to see which way this fell, withdrew his interest in the firm within the month. On Monday morning, Natalie arrived at 7:45, which was her usual time, and walked to her desk and set down her bag and her coffee. She looked at the central desk. The nameplate was gone. A junior from the strategy team sat in the chair, arranging papers with the careful efficiency of someone new to a space and still finding their place in it. The floor had absorbed the change the way it absorbed everything, by continuing, without announcement, without ceremony. Natalie looked at the empty space where the nameplate had been. She thought about the kitchen and the files and the grief underneath the control of someone who had built something and never found a way to leave it. She thought, I hope she finds it. Whatever she was looking for. She sat down. She opened her screen. She went to work. Brandon arrived at 8:42. He came in. He picked up the briefing folder. He looked at Natalie. She looked back with the expression she had used on the first morning she walked into this building. Level, folded hands, the quality of someone who had decided how this was going to go and intended to hold to it. He had put her through 10 days of distance, and she had not explained herself once. He opened his mouth. She had already turned back to her screen. 5 months ended on a Tuesday. She had known the date since the first week. It had been in her calendar as a private entry with no title. Just the date, blocked out, a marker for something she had been careful about deciding in advance. He called her in at 4 o'clock. The office was the same as it had always been. The desk, the shelving, the city behind glass, the whiteboard with its history of her handwriting. The building across the street was holding the afternoon light without drama, the way it always did.
The debt is settled.
He said.
As of today.
I know.
He looked at her.
The strategy position has been vacant since last month. The work you've done on the North Parcel, the risk documentation, the board work, it's the role you've been doing without the title.
She looked at the desk between them. She thought about the 10 days, the closed door, the look in the corridor that had held her name beside Calloway's and had said nothing. She thought about Megan's files in the archive, the work woven into the foundation, what it looked like, years later, to still be standing in a building you had helped build. She thought, I will not be the next person who stays so long that leaving becomes impossible.
No.
She said. He went still.
The work is right.
She said.
I came here because I cost you something. The account is settled. If I stay now, it has to be a choice I made from the outside, not one the building made for me.
She stood. She picked up her bag. On the desk, she left the spare pen, the spare notebook, the filing system notes she had written for whoever came next. She took only the photograph, her and Juniper from the gallery night, taken on someone's phone as they were leaving, both of them slightly damp from the walk, before the Alderton, before the debt, before any of it. She walked to the door.
Miss Newman.
He said. She stopped. She did not turn. He was quiet for a moment. She understood from the quality of it that he was choosing between several things he could say and finding none of them sufficient.
The position will wait,
he said finally, the voice of someone setting something down where it could be found later. She nodded once to the door. She walked out. She did not look back at the whiteboard. She did not need to. She knew her handwriting was still there. She knew he hadn't erased it. She took the elevator down through 23 floors and walked out of the building on Boylston Street into the cold of a Tuesday afternoon and stood for a moment on the pavement with the city around her and the photograph in her hand. She looked up at the building, then at the one across the street, pale stone and arched windows holding its position in the light. Answering, she thought, not showing off. She put her hands in her pockets and walked toward the bus stop. Epilogue. 3 weeks later, Juniper called on a Saturday morning with the specific energy of someone who had been planning something and was now executing it.
Come to dinner,
she said.
Where?
Natalie said.
Home.
A pause. They both understood what home meant. Natalie had never been to the Hayworth house. She had dropped Juniper at the gate once, months ago, from a cab, and had seen the iron gate and the driveway and the warmth of lit windows and had looked away.
Juniper.
It's just dinner. Mum's cooking. Brandon's going to be late. He always is on Saturdays. It'll be the three of us for at least 2 hours before he turns up.
Natalie looked at her ceiling.
Fine,
she said. The house was Georgian, set back from a quiet street in Back Bay, the kind of building that had been standing long enough to have stopped trying to impress anyone. Iron gate, stone path, the particular confidence of something built to last and aware of it. Juniper met her at the door. Dinner was warm and loud and easy in the way that houses were easy when someone in them knew how to make space for people. Their mother was a woman who moved through her own rooms as if they had always been full and was simply glad they were again. She asked Natalie questions about her work that were genuine rather than polite, and listened to the answers with the specific attention of someone who had raised 2 people who did the same. Afterward, Juniper took her on the house tour she had apparently been planning since the beginning, moving through rooms with the proprietorial ease of someone who had grown up in them and had opinions about all of them.
This was his when he was 12,
she said, opening a door off the upstairs corridor.
He turned it into the study when he moved back. Mum let him, because she thought it would mean he'd stay longer. He doesn't.
The study was, entirely predictably, him. Dark shelves, a wide desk, books organized in the system she now knew by sight. Subject, then frequency of use, the most reached for at eye level. A lamp with a green glass shade, the single piece of anything ornamental in the room. and beside the window, a chair that faced the street rather than the desk, which she found unexpectedly interesting. He worked at the desk. He thought at the chair.
5 minutes,
Juniper said.
I'm going to help Mum with the dessert. Do not reorganize anything.
I wouldn't.
You absolutely would.
She was already down the corridor. Natalie stood in the quiet study. She looked at the shelves and did not reorganize them, though the gap on the bottom shelf was going to require serious self-control. She looked at the chair by the window. She thought about Juniper's voice on the phone. When he finds something that matters, he doesn't let go, and looked at the room that contained, in every organized detail of it, a man she had spent 5 months learning to read. She heard the front door, then the stairs, then the study door opened. Brandon stopped in the doorway. He was in the state of a Saturday that had run long, jacket still on, collar slightly undone, the quality of someone arriving home who had not yet fully arrived. He looked at her standing in the middle of the room, among his books, 3 feet from the desk, and something in his face shifted the way it shifted when a calculation completed, and the answer was not what the working had prepared him for.
Juniper
Natalie said.
is helping with dessert.
I know.
He said. He came in. She moved toward the door, not retreating, simply making room, and they reached it at the same moment, and he put his hand flat against it and pushed it closed. Not hard, simply closed, with the certainty of someone who had made a decision. She looked at his hand on the door. She looked up at him. There was perhaps a foot between them. She was aware of the corridor outside her flat 5 months ago, and the hand at her waist, and the 10 days of closed doors, and the distance that had asked her a question she had refused to answer, and the way he had said the position will wait with the voice of someone setting something down to be found.
You should have told me,
he said. His voice was quiet, not accusation, something closer to the other side of it.
If I had told you,
she said,
you would have believed me. But it would have been my case. I needed it to be your conclusion.
The study was very quiet.
That
He said,
is the most inconvenient thing anyone has ever said to me.
I know.
She said. Something moved in his expression. Not quite the wry place, deeper than that, the place under the precision and the order that she had been catching glimpses of since the night in her corridor, when he had stepped back and said 9 o'clock and the building had closed behind him. He looked at her for a moment with the full attention that had never divided itself, not once in 5 months. Then he closed the remaining distance between them, 1 step, unhurried, decided, and kissed her. Not like the first time. The first time had been a lesson, a point made, a consequence delivered. This was none of that. This was a man who had spent 3 weeks with a gap on his floor and a whiteboard he hadn't erased, and had arrived at his own front door to find her standing in his study, and had run out of architecture to put between them. Both hands at her waist. No hesitation, no question in it. She was close against him, and the study was dim, and the city was outside, and none of the 5 months existed in the specific way that everything leading to a moment ceased to exist once the moment arrived. He broke it by an inch, looked at her. Her eyes were open and dark and entirely without the composure she had been maintaining since the morning she walked into his building with her bag over her shoulder and her expression set.
The position,
He said.
I'm not taking the position.
She said. He waited.
But I might
She said.
take the other thing.
He looked at her for a moment. Then the wry place, but warmer than it had ever been, and underneath it something that had been there since the beginning, she thought. Since the Alderton and the corridor and the 9 o'clock that had brought her to a building on Boylston Street and left her there, permanently changed, 5 months later. Downstairs, Juniper called up.
Dessert is ready, and I am choosing to believe you are looking at the bookshelves.
Natalie looked at the door. Brandon looked at the door.
She knew.
Natalie said.
she always knows.
He said. He opened the study door and held it. She looked at the gap on the bottom shelf. She thought about the pen on his desk, parallel to the edge, the first day. She thought about 5 months of careful distance and the whiteboard note he had never erased. Some things answered. Some things showed off. She was beginning to understand the difference. She walked out. He followed. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm and loud, and Juniper handed them both a plate without a word and smiled at something on the ceiling, which was the expression of someone who had been engineering this since October and was declining to be modest about it. Outside, the city held its evening the way it always had, without announcement, without ceremony, buildings answering buildings across the dark, the way they had been designed to. And that is where we leave them. 2 people who spent 5 months communicating in silences, in closed doors, in things set down carefully where they could be found later. We tell stories about restraint, about tension that earns its release, about characters who are intelligent enough to make falling difficult and human enough to fall anyway. That's what we do here, every time. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment telling me which moment landed hardest for you, and if you have someone in your life who would sit still for a story like this, send it to them. The next story is already waiting. I'll see you there.